Now, if you want to make an atheist cry, and I'm not saying that that should be your agenda, I'm not saying that's an appropriate agenda, but let's just say for argument's sake that that was your goal. You wanted to make an atheist cry. It's really pretty easy to do. It really is. It's honestly very easy to make an atheist cry. You just say to them, particularly if they were an ex-fundamentalist, you say, you were never a real Christian. I swear to God, they'll start crying. I swear to God, they'll start crying. Don't you say that. I was a real Christian. I was the greatest Christian since the Apostle Paul. You can't say that. I swear to God, that's my crying atheist. You don't like it? No, I really don't like it, Greg. Well, whatever. Deal with it. You know, it's only a YouTube video. Relax. So that's my crying atheist. That's one way to make an atheist cry. Another surefire way to make an atheist cry. By the way, that's a true way to make an atheist cry. I guarantee you, even right now, as we speak on Twitter, there's an atheist today, this very morning, who is probably crying over that very sentence. They cry about it. Oh, of course I was a real Christian. I was the greatest Christian since the Apostle Paul. Another way, surefire way to make an atheist cry, you say, atheist. Romans 1:20, atheists. You know God is real. You know God is real. That'll get them to cry too. Now, on that particular subject, last week I was listening to the Atheist Experience, and I think this guy actually was an atheist. I may link the conversation, but the conversation itself just got me thinking and was pretty much irrelevant to what I'm talking about. But I think the guy who called up was an atheist. And he offered Romans 1:20 to Matt Dillahunty. Now, Matt Dillahunty, honestly, is a little bit more of a real man than most of your garden variety atheists. So he wasn't crying about it. He really didn't cry about it. Yeah, he's kind of a real man, kind of, sort of. So, but his thing was, that may be true. Romans 1:20 may be true. I may know deep down inside that God is real. Prove it. Prove it to me. I don't know that I know it, so prove it to me. That's his thing. Which leads us to an interesting area of conversation. The difference between knowledge and belief. There's a big difference between knowledge and belief. Knowledge, in order for something to constitute knowledge, first of all, it has to be true. There has to be some form of factual predicate in order for you to consider it knowledge. Let's take, for example, you say, I know that the Germans won World War II. Well, okay, it's not possible for you to know that. Why? Because it isn't true. You believe it, sure, but you aren't correct. Google it and you'll see that you're not correct. Now, what atheists say a lot, and they are mistaken in saying this, is that belief is not a choice. Yes, it is. Belief is very much a choice. More specifically, it's usually a series of choices. In order to get a belief, you have 99 times out of 100, not always, but for the most part, followed a line of inquiry to its natural conclusion. Now, in that following the line of inquiry, you make a whole series of choices as to what constitutes relevant data. Take, for example, your flat earther. They have the same facts available to them that you and I have available to them. So how on earth are they coming to the conclusion that the earth is flat? Well, they're making a series of choices as to what they consider relevant to their inquiry. They just don't see some things. They just won't look at some things. Now, it's not possible to know the earth is flat. And if you're a flat earther listening to this, which not many of them do, I apologize. I think you're wrong. But I think you're wrong. I think you're mistaken. It's not possible to know that the Germans won World War II. Why? Because they didn't. Knowledge requires a factual predicate. In order for something to constitute knowledge, it has to be true. Okay, you with me so far? Belief is choice. 99 times out of 100, your beliefs are produced by choices. Oftentimes, there are emotional decision-making processes involved in beliefs, and oftentimes they are not available to you, the conscious agent. They're happening underneath the surface. You are not necessarily aware of them. So it is entirely possible to know something and yet not actually believe it. Really is. It's called denial. And it's the bread and butter of the addictive process. And in recoveries, they used to say, what's the biggest river in Egypt? Denial. It's the bread and butter of the addictive process. You know something. Deep down inside, you actually know it, but you, the conscious agent, refuses to see it, refuses to acknowledge it, refuses to accept it. Now, I'm not saying that's what's going on with atheists. So if you're an atheist, take a chill. I'm not saying that's what's happening. I'm just saying that's entirely possible, because that happens often in life, where you know something. Deep down inside, you know something is true, and you just refuse to accept it. You refuse to acknowledge it. And that's basically the argument of Romans 1:20. That you know that God is real. There's plenty of evidence available to you just through your natural senses. That's what it says. You look at things like the moon, the stars in the sky, and you go, hallelujah, something must have put me here. Now that doesn't strike you as a reasonable inference if you're an atheist. But honest to God, that strikes a lot of people as completely reasonable. That's why most people are believers. I remember one time at the dinner table with my family, we were having a conversation about belief in God. Kind of an interesting conversation to have, because every one of us was technically a Roman Catholic. Yeah, that's how it actually works in the real world. We were nominally Roman Catholic and we went to church on Christmas and Easter, but here we are having a conversation as to whether we in fact believe in God. And my father was one of the only ones who actually sided on, yeah, I definitely believe in God. And his inference and his reasoning was almost identical to Romans 1:20. He didn't read Romans 1:20. He didn't know that it said it, but he made the same sort of thing. I see mountains, I see skies, and I just think to myself, this is so majestic and perfect. Some sort of rigmarole around the idea of this is so majestic and perfect that I just think there's got to be a God. Something like that. So the created world itself bore witness to his heart and spoke to his heart and said, there's got to be a God. Okay, I'm not making any argument for God, atheists. So if you're an atheist playing along at home, relax. Just telling you there's a really big difference between knowledge and belief. So let's take another look. In order for something to constitute knowledge, it requires a factual predicate. Has to be true or it's not knowledge. Then it's belief. You can't know that the Germans won World War II because they didn't. Belief is emotions. It's based 100 times out of 100 more on your emotional life than it is on the actual facts of any given situation. You, the conscious agent, decide every step of the way which facts you find relevant to your particular line of inquiry. So if you're a flat earther and someone says, here, look, I don't even know, I've never watched a flat earther debate. I don't know what they say when you present them with look, here's a picture from outer space. I guess they don't believe that it's a picture. I have no idea how they keep that structure in place. But belief is emotions. And 99 times out of 100, those emotions are not available to you, the conscious agent. So let's take another example. If you're a parent and you're starting to suspect that your kid is doing drugs, you can refuse to accept it. You refuse to consciously believe it. Then you get enough evidence that you somewhere inside of yourself, oh God, I know. You see him smoke, you see him walking out, buying a dime bag from his friend. And you're like, oh, now I know. And you just keep it from your conscious awareness. You never quite know what you actually know. That's what Romans 1:20 is based on. It's not saying that you know. See, why atheists cry about it, and they do cry about it. Make no mistake, they will cry about this. But what they're crying about is, I think Paul Gia clarified this once, people use it against atheists in a way that's totally improper. I don't think that any atheist listening to me is lying to me that they don't believe in God. So let's just clear that up right now. No, I don't believe you're lying to me. I believe it's possible, and I'm not even sure this is true, but I'm just saying take a look because it's entirely possible, that you know something that you, the conscious agent, is not necessarily aware of. That happens in life all the flipping time. That's my point. That happens in life all the time, and that's entirely possible. So, when Matt Dillahunty goes, okay, prove it to me, that's not actually the wisest response to that. Now, granted, it's being framed in a way that's usually pretty dense, pretty dumb. It's usually not being presented as a good argument, but it is something worth considering if you are an atheist. Remember, I have no dog in this fight. One of the things that atheists tend to forget, if you're an atheist listening to my videos, I don't even know who you are. I don't care what you believe. It's not relevant to me. It's not my life. You believe whatever you want. It's not my life. You can be a flat earther for all I care. Why? Because you're not me. Makes no difference to me when I go to bed at night what anybody out there actually believes. I'm just doing my job as a Christian apologist. And doing my job as a Christian apologist, I thought I think it's relevant to bring to your attention that it is entirely possible. Now, I'm not saying this is what happens in your particular case, atheist. So again, take a chill. I'm not trying to make an atheist cry. I said if I wanted to. It's not my agenda. I really don't want to. I don't want you to cry, atheist. I really don't. I want you to be happy. I want you to examine the heart of the matter and get to the root. Because it's really at the root where most of the time, we in the Christian community as apologists and the atheists, we are arguing on the surface. And the surface is not relevant. What's going on underneath the surface? It is entirely possible to keep from your conscious awareness things that you actually know to be true. It is the entire bread and butter of the addictive process. Every single addict at some point or another knows for a fact that they have a problem. They refuse to acknowledge it, refuse to deal with it. We call it denial. It's entirely possible to do that in every single area of your life. Know something is true and yet not believe it. Yet not consciously believe it. Why? Because you are hiding from your own awareness. You are hiding from your own awareness the relevant data, the relevant information. You have conscious agency. There's a decision-making process, a choice involved over what you find relevant to discussion at hand and what you don't. And that emotional decision-making process comes to bear in every single belief that you have ever had. It's far more important. It's far more important. Now, we take the example of you can't believe that there was no president named Barack Obama. You know that Barack Obama was president. Or you're mistaken. You can believe something else. I said that wrong. You can't know something contrary to the truth. You can believe it till the cows come home, but you can't know it. Doesn't constitute knowledge. You can believe something that is false by never examining the relevant data in a way. All beliefs are predicated on following the line of inquiry to their logical conclusion. That's a fact. Even a flat earther. If you take what data they are, it's what's going into their data making decisions. In other words, what facts do they find relevant to their conclusion? They're not going about the conclusion in a way that's illogical. They aren't. It's what data is being processed. They are ignoring some data that other people would find highly relevant. It's pictures of the world from outer space. I ignore that data. I should use a better example because I've never watched a flat earth debate. I have no idea how they keep that particular delusion in place. I have no clue. But it's entirely possible to know something deep down in your little heart of hearts and yet not believe it as a conscious agent. Why? Because you are in charge of what you find relevant. If you're an atheist, okay, and I were able to assign you tasks for the next 2 months, I could turn you into a believer 100 times out of 100, case closed, promise. If I were able to say, you have to do this, you have to do this, this, and this. Now, I'm not saying you'd be an on-fire Christian, but I'm saying I could very easily construct a series of exercises and a series of links for you to click on, wherein within 2 months, you would have more God belief than you currently possess. Promise. I promise. And I don't mean that the way most Christians mean that, so hear that correctly. I don't mean I read Lee Strobel, Case for Christ. I don't mean anything like that. You got to read, here's C.S. Lewis. I don't mean that. I don't mean that. I mean, if I were in charge of what data you were allowed to take in and what you were not, I could easily construct a path for you wherein you would have more God belief. Choices involved every single solitary step of the way. Choices involved. How you frame it to yourself is really important to what conclusions you arrive at. And it's all emotional based. That's the only point I'm trying to make. It's all emotion based. So, the wiser course of action, if you're a Matt Dillahunty, is not to say, prove it to me that I know God exists, is to check it for yourself. That's why I say, this isn't between you and me, atheists. I don't care what you believe. The wisest course of action is to check it for yourself. Have I actually followed the relevant lines of inquiry to their logical conclusion? Because in the case of Christianity, I can tell you a lot of times where you dodge the most important parts. And Christians help you do it, to be quite frank with you. Most of the stuff that people are debating is not relevant to the proposition God exists, God does not exist. Did you hear me correctly? Most of the things that get debated on Twitter between Christians and atheists are not relevant. Are not relevant at all to the proposition God exists, God does not exist. Case in point, slavery in the Old Testament. It's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. Slavery can exist in the Old Testament. The Old Testament can endorse slavery. That can be factually true, and God can still exist. Those two have nothing to do logically one with the other. They don't cancel each other out mysteriously somehow. They're irrelevant. A can be true and B can be true at the exact same time. Most of your atheist counter-apologetics this is true of. Which means they aren't relevant to the proposition God exists, God does not exist. They aren't addressing what constitutes the actual belief. Promise. I promise that's true. A huge chunk of them aren't relevant at all. I would say 85 to 95% of them. The Old Testament debate is 30% of what gets debated. It's not relevant at all to the proposition God exists, God does not. It's not relevant at all. The Old Testament can endorse slavery. Let's just say for argument's sake that's true. That they're right. The Old Testament endorses slavery or tells you how to take care of your slaves or whatever. Let's just say that's true. Okay, that can be factually true and God can still exist. That doesn't have to have any bearing on whether God exists or God does not. Now, if you're an atheist, you're already doing some complex mental jujitsu to try and take issue with that. Well, but then God can't be good and blah, blah, blah. It's all bull. It's all bull. It's how you're framing the issue to yourself. That's all complete garbage. Whatever counter-apologetic you're about to lay down to me, it's fake. It's false. It's totally false through and through. Not 1 minute of relevance on the proposition God exists, God does not exist. Not 1 second of relevance. And some of you were preparing to lay it down like it's relevant. It isn't. You haven't really examined the proposition with any amount of real sincerity or integrity. You haven't. Most of the atheist counter-apologetics fall apart easily when you start to look at really look at the subject in a deep way. Now, I went from point A to point B a little quick. 17 minutes in. I'll go back onto this because this is actually really important. The only takeaway from what I'm talking about right now that you need to pay attention to right now. It's entirely possible. I'm not saying this is what happens in your case. It's entirely possible to know something for a fact deep down inside and yet not believe it consciously. It's entirely possible. Matter of fact, it's really common. It's really common. It's what people do all the time. Self-delusion. In a sense, there's no such thing as self-delusion because you're not aware that you're doing it. There are emotional decision-making processes going on underneath the surface of your conscious awareness. And that's what constitutes your belief. 100 times out of 100. Sometimes those line up with the facts, sometimes they don't. The facts usually aren't all that relevant, to be perfectly honest with you. They're not. They're not. That's why when I said, if you're an atheist and your pride and joy is your critical thinking, apply your critical thinking to yourself and your own motivations. See if you can't discern another agenda than just merely the truth. Because I easily could if I hung out with you for 5 minutes. Critical thinking in relationship to events out there, to facts out in the real world is smart, but it's not really all that important. Critical thinking in relationship to yourself, that's called wisdom. And that's extraordinarily important. That's the most valuable thing you could ever do to yourself. Give yourself that gift today. You think that you're a really good critical thinker? Atheism has taught you critical thinking and that's really important to you and you're so grateful that you learned critical thinking from the atheist. Great, I applaud critical thinking. Don't just apply it where it's easy. The earth isn't 6,000 years old, Craig. Okay, good, easy. Easy one. Use your critical thinking and apply it to yourself. See through yourself. That's called wisdom. That's not easy to do. It's really hard to do, but it's extraordinarily valuable. And it's 1,000 times more important than applying critical thinking to whatever's going on out there. 1,000 times more important. And your beliefs are not choices, or your knowledge is not a choice. Atheists will tell you belief is not a choice. Wrong. Belief is a series of choices taking place for emotional reasons, often underneath your conscious awareness. Knowledge is not a choice. Knowledge has to be true in order for it to constitute knowledge. It has to have a factual predicate. Your beliefs do not. And they are totally and entirely up to you. They are choices. Every step of the way, choices. The example I used, and then I'll let this end. The example I used in another video. I believe that Hitler divided his forces, that in Operation Barbarossa, Hitler could have taken Moscow had he pressed straight through. Is that something that just occurred to me somehow? No. I followed a line of inquiry. First of all, I had to choose a book to believe. I honestly believe that Hitler split his forces, tried to take the oil fields down the Caucasus, Operation Barbarossa. Yeah, it's weird, but it's true. It's a weird example, but the example underscores the point. I honest to God believe that about World War II, that if Hitler had pressed through, he could have taken Moscow. But he split his forces so that he could, divided his forces so he could take the oil fields down the Caucasus. That's actual history of Operation Barbarossa. Look it up. And I honestly believe that he could have won World War II had he not have done that. That didn't just appear to me from on high somewhere. That's what atheists act like beliefs are. Beliefs aren't like that. How did that belief come to me? I followed a line of inquiry to its logical conclusion. I started reading a book and I made choices every step of the way. Which books are relevant and which books are not. Every step of the way in beliefs you make choices. Those choices are conscious or are at least semi-conscious. There's emotion involved every step of the way. Now, where atheists are correct is knowledge. Knowledge is not a choice. You can't know something that isn't true. In order for it to be knowledge, it's got to be true. So, there you have it, kids. That's all for you. It's a little rambly, but some of these were really good points. So I will leave it for now. That is all for now. The Mass has ended. Go in peace. Amen.